Imagine watching FBI agents put handcuffs on your powerful CEO while everyone in the boardroom stares at you with wide eyes, all because you fixed one broken engine and kept the papers that proved he was willing to let people die for money. Today's story is about a factory mechanic who sent his rich boss to prison after being called a worthless grease monkey in front of everyone he worked with. I'll never forget that moment in the boardroom. Grease still under my fingernails. FBI agents reading my CEO his rights. My hands finally stopped shaking after 3 months of fear. The room smelled like his expensive cologne mixed with sweat. Pure fear sweat. 12 board members sat frozen. Coffee cups stopped halfway to their lips. I held up the papers that would send Richard Harrington to prison for 25 years. 3 months before this, he called me a grease monkey. Said it in front of everyone. In front of my friends. My co-workers. People I'd worked with for 15 years. Now his shiny shoes were being replaced with prison boots. If revenge is a game of chess, I just said checkmate. And all I used was some old maintenance logs and a safety report from the year my father got hurt. Let me take you back to where it all began, before the FBI agents and hidden recordings and late nights digging through company servers. 6 months earlier, I was just Marcus Chun, a regular mechanic at Apex Automotive Industries, the same Detroit factory where my dad worked until that machine crushed his spine in 2008, and I still kept his employee badge in my old metal toolbox as a reminder that trusting the wrong people can cost you everything. The factory smelled the same every morning, oil and metal and coffee from the break room, and I had no idea then that my life was about to change because of one broken engine and one rich man's mistake of thinking that someone with grease-stained hands couldn't possibly be smart enough to bring down his empire. But first, I had to survive what came next. My alarm always went off at 4:30 in the morning, and I'd feel around in the dark for my work clothes, the ones that still smelled like yesterday's grease and metal even though I washed them twice. And I'd think about how my dad used to do the same thing when I was little. The Detroit winter was mean that December morning, biting through my jacket as I show my badge at the gate, walk past rows of half-built cars, and breathe in that special mix of motor oil, hot metal, and the burned coffee smell that followed Jake from security wherever he went. 15 years at Apex Automotive, and I could tell you the story of every scratch on my toolbox, every scar on my hands, and exactly what was wrong with an engine just by listening to it run for 10 seconds. Morning, Marcus called Freddie from the testing bay, his voice echoing across the empty factory floor before the day's shift arrived. Heard the new V12 prototype is coming in today. I nodded and hung my jacket in my locker, the one with my dad's picture taped inside, him standing proud his Apex uniform before the accident in 2008 that put him in a wheelchair for life. The company called it an unfortunate equipment failure, but Dad always said something felt wrong with that engine before it blew, like it was built to break in just the right way. He tried to warn them, but nobody listened to assembly line workers back then. Janet Morrison walked over with her clipboard, her supervisor badge catching the fluorescent lights. "Marcus, how's your father doing this week?" she asked, and I believed she cared back then, before I knew the truth about her. She'd worked her way up from the line, knew everybody's kids' names, brought donuts on Fridays, and made us feel like maybe the big bosses upstairs actually saw us as people. "He's okay. Same as always," I said, pulling on my work gloves. "Physical therapy on Tuesdays, chess with me on Sundays." Janet nodded and lowered her voice. "Listen, the new V12 is Harrington's baby. He's betting the company on it. When it comes in, I want you to look it over first before the engineers get their hands on it." I felt proud that she trusted me, that someone finally saw what I could do, and I nodded as she walked away to check on the other early birds. Janet was good people, I thought, or at least she was good at pretending to be. The next day, I was eating lunch in the break room when an email popped up on my phone from the company-wide list. Something boring about adjusted failure threshold parameters for the new V12 engine line. Most guys would have deleted it, but my dad taught me to read everything, especially the stuff that sounds like it's trying to put you to sleep, and that's when I found the first red flag in a routine email. There it was in black and white. 10,000-mile expected operational ceiling. My sandwich dropped from my hand as I stared at my phone screen, because 10,000 miles wasn't a coincidence. It was exactly when the 2008 engines failed, the exact model that exploded on the line and crushed 3 workers, including my father. This wasn't some new design flaw. This was the old nightmare wrapped in shiny new packaging, and suddenly I could hear my dad's voice from his hospital bed. That engine was wrong, Marcus. Nobody builds something that breaks in exactly the same way every time by accident. Has your expertise ever been completely ignored by management when you knew something was dangerously wrong? I printed the email and slipped it into my dad's old toolbox, not knowing then that this single piece of paper would be the first thread that would unravel a billion-dollar conspiracy. Later that afternoon, Janet found me testing a fuel line. "Heads up," she said casually. "Executives are visiting next week. Big showcase for the V12. Harrington himself will be here with the board." My stomach tightened at her words, but not from excitement, from the sick feeling of recognizing the same failure point that crushed my father's spine. December 15th started like any normal workday until my phone buzzed with Janet's text message at 6 a.m. "All hands on deck, executives arriving at 9. Make everything perfect." And my stomach did that nervous flip it always does when the suits come down from their glass offices to walk among us regular people like they're visiting a zoo. The factory floor buzzed with nervous energy as guys who hadn't tucked in their shirts in years suddenly looked presentable, and all the usual joking and laughing got replaced with careful silence and worried glances at the clock, because we all knew that these visits could mean layoffs if something didn't look right to the money people. By 8:45, our section of the plant looked better than it ever had during actual work days. Floors scrubbed, tools arranged like in a fancy catalog picture. In the new V12 prototype, sitting under perfect lighting in the testing bay, all $20 million of it gleaming like it was already in showroom somewhere. We'd spent 3 days cleaning instead of actually fixing things, which always seemed backwards to me. But nobody asked the grease-stained guys what made sense when it came to impressing people in suits. The black SUVs pulled up outside at 9:07, and we watched through the big windows as Richard Harrington III stepped out, surrounded by vice presidents and board members, and some people with press badges who were taking notes. Harrington walked like he owned not just the company, but the ground under it, and maybe the air too. Chin up, shoulders back, not looking at anyone's face as they opened doors for him. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the concrete floor like he was keeping time to music only important people could hear, and I couldn't help noticing how different that sound was from our steel-toed work boots that thudded quietly as we moved out of his way. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing through our suddenly silent workspace. "Today you witness the future of American automotive excellence. The Phoenix V12 will revolutionize." But then came the sound every mechanic knows and dreads. Absolutely nothing. The engine wouldn't start. Not a click, not a whir, nothing. $20 million of dead metal sitting there, while photographers checked their cameras and executives shifted uncomfortably. Harrington's smooth face turned blotchy red. "What's wrong with it?" he demanded, looking at the head engineer, Paul Morrison, who happened to be Janet's nephew with a fancy degree, but only 2 years of actual experience. Paul tapped frantically at his tablet. "Sir, it was running perfectly an hour ago. I don't understand." "Fix it. Now," Harrington snapped. "The press will be here in 90 minutes for the official showcase." That's when I made the mistake that would change everything. The words just tumbled out of my mouth before my brain could stop them. Maybe if you hired real engineers instead of promoting your golf buddies, this wouldn't happen. The factory floor went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Every head turned toward me. Janet's face went white. Paul's mouth hung open like a fish. And Harrington's eyes locked onto me, like a predator spotting prey. His expensive shoes clicked slowly, deliberately across the concrete as he walked toward me, and each click seemed to echo off the high ceiling. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. I should have apologized. Should have backed down. But 15 years of watching talented mechanics get overlooked while kids with connections got promoted had built up like pressure in a bad fuel line. I said maybe you should value competence more than connections. I replied, my voice steadier than I felt inside. "You think you could do better, grease monkey?" he asked, saying those 2 words like they tasted bad in his mouth. And everyone heard it. Everyone saw him look at my oil-stained hands like they were something disgusting. "I know I could," I said, though my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Harrington smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. It was the kind of smile a cat might give a mouse it's about to eat. "Perfect. You have 90 minutes. Fix this engine before the press arrives, and I'll make you chief engineer. Fail, and you're blacklisted from every automotive shop in the country." My boss smiled and said, "Let's keep this between us," as she pulled me aside, her fingernails digging into my arm. "Marcus, don't do this. Just apologize. He'll destroy you." "He already has," I said, pulling away and walking toward the dead engine. As I popped the cover, something felt familiar. The particular way this engine wasn't working reminded me of something I'd seen before. The silence had a pattern, just like my dad had taught me. Every machine speaks its own language, and this one was telling me something I'd heard 15 years ago. My hands moved almost on their own, checking connections, testing sensors, measuring pressure points, while executives huddled nearby, checking their watches and whispering about damage control. 40 minutes in, I found it. Buried under 3 layers of components was a sensor exactly like the one from the 2008 defect, the one that had caused so many accidents, the one that had broken my father's back. It was deliberately miscalibrated to fail after exactly 10,000 miles of use. Just long enough to clear the warranty period. Just deadly enough to cause catastrophic failures that would look like driver error. Why would they deliberately include a known defect in their flagship engine? Who puts a time bomb in their own product? I could have just fixed it quietly. Could have replaced the sensor, started the engine, and walked away. But I thought about my father in his wheelchair, about the families who lost loved ones in 2008, about the thousands who would buy this engine thinking it was safe. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. Every serial number, every connection, every piece of evidence showing this wasn't a mistake, but a design choice. Then I fixed it the right way, the way it should have been built in the first place, the way that would keep people safe instead of making them unwitting victims of corporate greed. The engine roared to life with just 3 minutes to spare, purring with a sound so perfect that even some of the engineers nodded in respect. Harrington's relief lasted exactly 3 seconds before I spoke up, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll take that promotion now, and I want it in writing." His fake smile returned as he clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that felt like being hit. "Of course. Janet will handle the paperwork. Congratulations, Chief Engineer Chun." He said it like we were sharing a joke, like everyone was in on it except me, like my life and skills and 15 years of perfect work were just a punchline to him. He said it like we were nothing, like we were all nothing. Have you ever been mocked for knowing more than your boss, for being right when they needed you to be wrong? That night, alone in my apartment still wearing my work clothes, I got an email that would pull the first thread of Harrington's perfect life until it all unraveled. Anonymous sender. No subject line. Just 7 words that made my blood run cold. Check your father's accident report. Page 47. I sat in my small apartment with the lights low, still in my work clothes that smelled like the factory, staring at those 7 words on my phone screen until they burned into my eyes. Check your father's accident report. Page 47. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dug through the storage boxes I hadn't opened since Dad moved to the care facility, tossing aside old photo albums and birthday cards until I found the thick manila folder with workers' compensation claim hashtag 847B stamped across the front in faded red letters. The report weighed heavy in my trembling hands, like it contained more than just paper, like it held all the pain and broken dreams of the past 15 years inside its worn edges. I flipped through pages of medical jargon and legal talk that was designed to confuse regular people, past the photos of the damaged engine, past the doctor's reports about my father's shattered spine, all the way to page 47, which had a watermark across it that read, "Internal Review, Confidential." And there it was, clear as day, in black ink. Richard Harrington III signature on a memo dated 3 weeks before my father's accident, acknowledging the potential catastrophic failure of the 2008 engine sensor, noting the prohibitive cost of total recall, and approving something called Risk Management Protocol 17 instead. Below his signature was a handwritten note. Legal has run the numbers. Projected lawsuit settlements still cheaper than recall. Proceed as planned. He knew. He knew the engines would fail. He knew people would die. He knew my father would be hurt. And he decided their lives were worth less than money. The room seemed to spin around me as I carefully took pictures of every page with my phone, uploaded them to 3 different cloud accounts, and then returned the report to its folder. I didn't sleep that night, just sat watching the sunrise through my window, thinking about how different my life might have been if Harrington had just fixed those engines 15 years ago. When I arrived at work the next morning at 5 a.m., my keycard wouldn't open the employee entrance. The red light blinked at me like an accusation, and I was standing there confused when two security guards I'd known for years approached with faces that wouldn't meet my eyes. Marcus Chun, the taller one, said, like he hadn't eaten lunch with me hundreds of times. "You need to come with us." "What's going on, Mike?" I asked, but he just shook his head slightly. They led me through the visitor entrance to a small conference room where Janet sat with Paul Morrison and a woman I'd never seen before wearing a company legal department badge. On the table in front of them was a stack of papers and a laptop showing emails I'd supposedly sent to our biggest competitor, offering to sell them design specifications for the V12. "This is fabricated," I said, my voice sounding calmer than I felt as cold dread spread through my chest. "I've never seen these emails before." Janet wouldn't meet my eyes as she spoke. "Marcus, we have your login credentials accessing these files last night at 11:52 p.m. 11:52 p.m., exactly 5 minutes after I'd received the anonymous email. While I was searching through boxes for my father's accident report, someone was using my work credentials to frame me. "I want to see the security footage," I said. The lawyer smiled thinly. "That won't be necessary. You're terminated effective immediately for corporate espionage and theft of proprietary information. Security will escort you to your locker and then off the premises." She slid a paper across the table. "And Marcus, Mr. Harrington wanted you to know that the promotion, it was never real. No court would enforce a verbal offer made in jest. In jest. Like my entire career was just a joke to him. HR scheduled a quick chat. Without me. I felt something shift inside me then, not breaking but hardening, like metal being forged. I kept my face perfectly blank as I signed the termination papers, asked for copies of everything, and let security watch me clean out my locker. I didn't speak, didn't argue, just carefully wrapped my tools in my old work shirt and placed my father's badge in my pocket, right next to my phone with its evidence safely backed up. As I walked through the parking lot for the last time, a woman hurried up beside me. Sarah Kim from accounting, someone I'd only nodded hello to a few times in the break room. She didn't look at me as she fell in a step beside me, just slipped a folded sticky note into my hand. "Don't call from your regular phone," she whispered, then walked quickly toward the main building. I waited until I was in my car to unfold the note, which had a phone number and 6 words that would change everything. "My brother died in an Apex car. Have you ever been terminated for doing the right thing? For knowing too much? For refusing to be part of the problem?" That afternoon, from a payphone at a gas station across town, I called the number. Sarah answered on the first ring. "Marcus, I've been waiting for someone like you," she said, her voice intense but quiet. "I know Harrington framed you. I know about the defective engines. I know what they did to your father. And I'm not the only one who's been gathering evidence. Why help me?" I asked, still not sure if I could trust anyone. "Because my brother Tony's car had an Apex engine," she replied, her voice catching slightly. "It failed at exactly 10,000 miles on a mountain road. The company called it driver error. It wasn't. The weight of what we were up against settled on my shoulders. A billion-dollar company, a CEO with politicians in his pocket, a system designed to crush people like us. But for the first time since finding that accident report, I felt something beyond anger and betrayal. I felt hope. "When can we meet?" I asked. Sarah's apartment looked like the back room of a law office that had exploded. Banker's boxes stacked from floor to ceiling along every wall, their white lids labeled with dates and names in black marker, creating a paper fortress of evidence that smelled like old documents and fresh determination. Red string connected photos and documents on a massive corkboard that covered an entire wall. And I stood there staring at this shrine to corporate crimes while Sarah made coffee with hands that shook just enough to make the spoon clink against the ceramic mug. 3 years, she said quietly, setting a cup in front of me on the dining table that was completely buried under spreadsheets and printed emails. 3 years since Tony died on Route 49, his car wrapped around a tree because the engine seized at exactly 10,247 miles. And the police report said he must have been speeding even though Tony never went over the limit in his life. She pulled out a folder marked 2019, Q3 Trading, in red ink, her fingers tracing over her brother's name written on the tab, and I could see how many times she must have opened this folder by how worn the edges were. "Look at this pattern," she said, spreading out stock trading records that showed massive sell orders. 3 weeks before Tony's crash and the 12 other accidents that month, Richard Harrington sold 500,000 shares of Apex stock through a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Blue Horizon Holdings. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. He's betting against his own company. Every single time, there's a cluster of engine failures, Sarah continued, pulling out more documents that showed the same pattern over and over. He sells high right before the accidents. Then after the bad press hits and stock drops, he buys everything back at a 30% discount, making millions while families plan funerals. The scope of it made my stomach turn. This wasn't just negligence or corporate greed. This was premeditated murder turned into a business model. And suddenly I understood why Sarah had spent 3 years building this paper mountain in her living room. We need more than financial records to prove intent, I said, though the evidence was already overwhelming. We need technical proof that the defects are intentional, not just bad engineering. That's why we need the others, Sarah said, and she picked up her phone to send a text. Tom Rodriguez from Legal has been collecting evidence for 5 years, and Dr. Emily Foster. You remember her from engineering? She has something you need to see. That's when I noticed something alarming in the metadata. While Sarah was texting, I've been looking at the trading dates more carefully, comparing them to a calendar on my phone, and there was a pattern that made my blood run cold. Sarah, look at this. Every major sell happens exactly 10,000 miles after a new model launches, calculated from average driving statistics. Which means, she asked, though I could see she already knew. He's not reacting to accidents. He's scheduling them. We met Tom Rodriguez that evening at a 24-hour diner 30 miles outside Detroit, the kind of place where truckers stop for coffee and nobody asks questions. Tom looked like he hadn't slept well in years. Dark circles under his eyes and a nervous habit of checking over his shoulder every few minutes. But when he slid a flash drive across the cracked vinyl table, his hand was steady. 5 years of watching Harrington destroy lives while I'm supposed to defend the company in court, he said, his voice bitter with exhaustion. This drive has safety reports he buried, emails where executives explicitly discuss what they call the acceptable casualty rate, and meeting minutes where they actually calculated that lawsuit settlements would be cheaper than recalls. Why didn't you report this earlier? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. To whom exactly? HR reports directly to Harrington. The board members are all his Yale fraternity brothers, and the regulatory agencies are run by former Apex executives who still own stock options. What about the FBI? Securities fraud is federal, I suggested. Without technical proof that the defects are intentional and not just incompetence, it's just speculation and conspiracy theories, Tom replied, then looked at me directly. That's why I need you. Marcus, you understand the engineering. You can prove this isn't an accident. The next morning, we met Dr. Emily Foster at a park near the river, far from any Apex buildings or security cameras. She looked older than I remembered, like being demoted from head of engineering to the mailroom had aged her 10 years and 3, but her eyes still had that sharp intelligence that had made her one of the best engineers in the industry. I have the original V12 design, she said, pulling blueprints from a weatherproof tube. My design, safe, efficient, would have lasted 300,000 miles easy. And I have Harrington's modified version, the one he personally signed off on after hiring outside consultants to make it look like an improvement. She spread both blueprints on the picnic table, and even in the morning sunlight, the differences were obvious. Harrington hadn't just allowed a defective sensor to remain, he had deliberately added one to a perfectly safe design. The consultant report claimed it would improve performance metrics and reduce manufacturing costs by 12%, Emily explained, her finger tracing the deadly modification. But it's really a time bomb set to go off at 10,000 miles, and every single V12 engine will fail catastrophically, probably killing whoever's inside. How many V12s are set to ship? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. First batch is 50,000 units, starting January 1st, Emily said quietly. That's potentially 50,000 deaths Harrington has already calculated into his stock portfolio. Sarah had been typing on her phone, cross-referencing dates, and suddenly she gasped. The next major sell order. It's scheduled for December 30th, 2 days before the V12 launch. He's going to dump everything, Tom said, understanding immediately. Make his biggest profit yet, and probably disappear before the bodies start piling up. That's when the full horror hit me, and I said the words that had been building in my mind. He knows when they'll die because he decides when they'll die. Have you found allies in unexpected places at work? People who were fighting the same fight, but thought they were alone until you showed up? We sat there in the morning sun, for people who had been pushed too far by the same monster, and without saying it out loud, we all knew what had to happen next. Harrington thought he was untouchable, protected by money and connections, and a system designed to shield men like him. He was wrong. I couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning in my small bed while names and dates and evidence swirled through my mind like a tornado made of paper and lies. So at 3 a.m. I gave up and started mapping out the company structure on my laptop, trying to understand who else knew about the murders disguised as accidents. The deeper I dug into email chains Tom had provided and financial records Sarah had traced, the more I realized this wasn't just Harrington working alone. This was a whole network of people who had chosen money over lives, promotions over principles. Janet Morrison, my supervisor who had asked about my father every week and brought me soup when I was sick and remembered my birthday for 10 straight years, had been feeding Harrington information the entire time. Sarah found emails going back a decade where Janet reported every safety concern raised by floor workers directly to the CEO's office, every attempt to organize better working conditions, every person who asked too many questions about the 2008 accidents, and in return she was promised a VP position that would pay more than she'd make in 20 years of honest work. The betrayal hit me like a physical punch to the gut because Janet had visited my father in the hospital after his accident, had held my mother's hand at the funeral when she died of a broken heart 2 years later, had told me she was proud of me for following in my dad's footsteps. She'd looked me in the eyes at my mother's grave and promised to look out for me at work. And the whole time she was reporting my every move to the man who had destroyed my family. "It gets worse," Tom said when we gathered at Sarah's apartment the next night, his face grim as he pulled up union documents on his laptop. "Mike Kowalski, your union rep who's supposed to protect workers? He's been getting $50,000 a year in consulting fees from a subsidiary of Apex, paid to make sure the union never pushes too hard on safety concerns or asks for independent investigations." I thought about all the times Mike had told us to be patient when we reported problems, to trust the process when safety equipment wasn't replaced, to think about job security when someone suggested going to OSHA, and now I understood why our union never seemed to win anything important. But the worst discovery came when Emily called me at 2 a.m., her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her at first. "Marcus, you need to see something about your father's accident. Something I found in the archived server files from 2008. We met at an all-night coffee shop downtown, the fluorescent lights making everything look harsh and unforgiving, and Emily's hands trembled as she opened her laptop to show me an email chain I'd never seen before. My father had filed a formal safety complaint about the engine defects 2 weeks before his accident, had gathered 12 other workers to sign a petition demanding an OSHA investigation, and was scheduled to meet with federal inspectors on March 15, 2008. His accident happened on March 13, 2008. "Look at this routing document," Emily said, pulling up another file that showed engine assignments. "That specific engine, the one that exploded at your father's station, was originally assigned to Base 7 for testing, but Harrington personally changed the routing to send it to your father's station." "You're saying—" I couldn't finish the sentence, my throat closing up with rage and grief. "Your father wasn't collateral damage. He was targeted," Emily said quietly, and that's when a coffee cup in my hand shattered, the hot liquid mixing with blood from the cuts on my palm as ceramic pieces scattered across the table. I didn't even feel the pain, just stared at the red coffee dripping onto the white table, while everything I thought I knew about my father's accident rearranged itself into something much darker. Harrington hadn't just ignored safety concerns that led to an accident. He had attempted to murder my father to stop him from exposing the conspiracy, and when Dad survived in a wheelchair instead of dying, Harrington probably considered it good enough. "There's more," Sarah said, looking at her phone with growing alarm. "I've been tracking Harrington's travel plans, and he's booked a private jet to the Cayman Islands for December 30th, right after the board meeting, where he'll announce the merger with Stellantis. He's planning to run," Tom said, understanding immediately. "Announce the merger. Watch the stock triple. Sell everything. and disappear to a non-extradition country before the first V-12 fails. HR intervened with a competing emergency meeting about me. My phone rang then, showing Janet's number for the first time since my termination, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me swipe the screen. "Marcus, please, you need to stop whatever you're doing," Janet said, and she sounded genuinely scared. "Harrington knows you're investigating him, knows about your little group, and he's not going to let you interfere with the merger. Like he didn't let my father interfere with his profits." I asked, my voice cold and steady despite the rage burning in my chest. Janet was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Your father that wasn't supposed to happen that way. He was just supposed to be scared, not hurt. I tried to warn him, Marcus. I really did, but he wouldn't listen. You knew." The words came out as barely a whisper. "You knew Harrington was going after my father, and you did nothing?" "I was nobody then, just a line worker trying to survive," she said, but even she didn't sound like she believed her own excuse. "Marcus, I'm trying to help you now. Harrington's planning something for the board meeting, something to discredit you all before you can act." "What kind of something?" I demanded. "I don't know exactly, but he's been meeting with his security team, and there's talk about arrests, about planting evidence, about making sure none of you can testify against him. Have you discovered your mentor was actually your enemy? That the person you trusted most was the one making sure you never succeeded?" After I hung up, we all sat in silence for a moment, understanding that we were running out of time and that Harrington was more dangerous than we'd imagined, willing to kill not just strangers for profit, but anyone who threatened his empire. "We need to move fast," I said, looking at my makeshift team of broken people seeking justice. "The board meeting is in 4 days, and we need to be ready for whatever trap he's setting." The decision to infiltrate Apex and gather the final evidence wasn't really a decision at all. It was the only option left that might stop 50,000 murders and finally get justice for my father and all the others who had died for Harrington's stock portfolio. 3 nights before the board meeting, I did something I never thought I'd do in my life. I became a criminal, or at least that's what the law would call it, though I knew in my heart I was doing the most honest thing I'd done in years. The forgotten maintenance tunnels under the Apex factory smelled like rust and old concrete and decades of dust that hadn't been disturbed since the last renovation in 1995, and as I crawled through them with just a small flashlight between my teeth, I could almost feel my father's presence guiding me through passages he'd shown me when I was 12 years old. Every building is bones. Dad had told me during one of those weekend visits when he'd bring me to work because Mom was sick and we couldn't afford a babysitter. And if you know the bones, you can go anywhere without being seen. He'd shown me these tunnels then, remnants from when the factory was built in the 1960s, forgotten by everyone except the old-timers who were all retired or dead now, connected by mechanical locks that hadn't been updated because nobody remembered they existed. My father's keys still worked on those locks, the metal warm in my sweaty palm as I turned them one by one, making my way from the old factory building toward the executive tower that had been built on top of the original structure like a glass parasite. The tunnel was barely 3 feet high in some places, forcing me to crawl on my hands and knees through spider webs and pools of water that had leaked through from storms nobody knew about, and every sound I made seemed to echo forever in the darkness. At 2 a.m. exactly, I emerged through a maintenance panel in the sub-basement of the executive building, 3 floors below the server room, my work coveralls covered in decades of grime that actually helped me blend into the shadows. The building was supposed to be empty except for 2 security guards who made rounds every 30 minutes, and I timed my entry for exactly 3 minutes after they passed the basement, giving me 27 minutes to get to the server room, download what we needed, and get back to the tunnels. The old freight elevator still worked, but would show up on security monitors, so I took the stairs, each step careful and quiet in my father's old work boots that I'd wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The server room was behind a modern glass door with a keycard reader that should have stopped me cold, but Emily had taught me about the maintenance override built into every reader for emergency access. You hold a powered card to the sensor while entering the master code that nobody had bothered to change since 1987, the year Harrington's father founded the company. The door clicked open, and I slipped into a room that hummed with thousands of hard drives storing every email, every memo, every video conference, every piece of evidence that Harrington thought was protected by passwords, an encryption that meant nothing when you had physical access to the servers. Emily had given me a special flash drive with self-executing code that would copy everything while making it look like routine maintenance, and all I had to do was plug it into the main terminal and wait. As the progress bar crept forward, showing 37 minutes remaining for the full download, I used my phone to look through some of the files that were already copying, and what I found made me understand why Harrington felt so untouchable. There were emails to senators discussing campaign contributions in exchange for blocking safety regulations, recordings of meetings with federal judges who owed him favors, documents showing he owned shares in the insurance companies that would deny claims when Apex engines failed. The recordings revealed something darker than expected. At the 28-minute mark, I found a folder labeled Contingency Planning that contained video files from board meetings, and I clicked on one from last month where Harrington's voice filled my earbuds. "Gentlemen, let me be clear about our position. We're not in the automobile business. We're in the risk management business. Every death is calculated. Every lawsuit is budgeted. Every widow's tears are factored into our quarterly projections." Another board member's voice responded, "But Richard, at what point do the numbers become untenable?" "Never," Harrington replied with a laugh that made my skin crawl. "Because we don't just own the cars, we own the investigators, the regulators, the judges, and most importantly, we own the narrative. When someone dies in an Apex vehicle, it's always driver error, never design flaw." "What about the Chin situation?" someone asked, and my blood froze. "The mechanic? He's been handled, terminated, discredited. And if he continues to be a problem, well, his father's accident wasn't fatal, but that can be corrected." They were talking about finishing what they'd started with my father, about murdering him in his care facility, and I had to pause the recording because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone steady. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside, the distinctive sound of security boots on polished floors, and the door handle started to turn. I killed my flashlight and ducked behind a server rack just as the door opened and a beam of light swept across the room. The security guard stepped inside, his radio crackling with static, and I held my breath as he walked past my hiding spot so close I could smell the coffee on his breath. "Yeah, I'm checking the server room now," he said into his radio, the beam of his flashlight passing inches from my foot. "Temperature alarm is showing an anomaly, but everything looks normal, probably just the system acting up again like last week." He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, then finally left, and I stayed frozen in place for another full minute before daring to move again. The download had 12 minutes remaining, and I spent them reading through more files, finding budget spreadsheets that literally had a column labeled Anticipated Fatalities, next to Projected Revenue Impact, seeing emails where they discussed the best time of year to release defective products to maximize insurance claim delays. They were counting deaths like inventory, scheduling murders like product launches, treating human lives like numbers on a spreadsheet. And every document I read made me think of my father in his wheelchair, of Tony Kim wrapped around a tree, of 50,000 families who didn't know they were about to buy time bombs disguised as cars. When the download finally finished at 4:47 a.m., showing 2.7 terabytes of evidence copied successfully, I made my way back through the tunnels faster than I'd come, not caring about the noise anymore, just needing to get out of that building that felt like a tomb for all of Harrington's future victims. I emerged from a storm drain 2 blocks away, just as the sun started to lighten the eastern sky, covered in filth and spider webs, but carrying enough evidence to destroy an empire. Back at Sarah's apartment, we spent the next 6 hours reviewing what I'd found, and each new document was worse than the last. Tom found legal precedents Harrington had paid judges to establish that would make prosecution nearly impossible. Sarah discovered offshore accounts in countries without extradition treaties, and Emily identified 17 other Apex models with deliberately designed failure points, some dating back 20 years. "This isn't just about the V12, Emily said quietly, her face pale as she read through technical specifications. "He's been doing this since he took over from his father, turning the entire company into a murder machine that prints money. Have you ever risked everything for evidence, knowing that being caught would mean not just losing your job, but possibly your life?" But the document that would change everything was hidden in a folder labeled Insurance, and when Sarah opened it, we all stopped breathing. It was a memo from Harrington to his inner circle, dated a week ago. "Begin shorting Apex stock December 30th. Stellantis merger announcement will triple value, allowing us to clear $500 million before first V12 failures trigger market crash. Destroy all evidence, January 2nd. We had them. We had everything. Now we just had to survive long enough to use it. We moved to a cheap hotel outside Detroit that night because Sarah was convinced her apartment was being watched, and the four of us sat in the dark room, lit only by the glow of our laptop screens that made our faces look ghostly blue, while we searched through the mountain of evidence for something that even Harrington's bought judges couldn't ignore. The room smelled like old cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, and we'd pushed the two beds together to make a workspace covered in printed documents and flash drives, looking like the world's most depressing study group, except we were studying how to destroy a murderer who owned half the justice system. His weakness appeared in the audit trail. Tom found it first, buried in the Sarbanes-Oxley compliance folders that every public company has to maintain, documents that automatically upload to federal databases that even Harrington couldn't access or delete. "Look at this," Tom said, his voice tight with excitement as he turned his laptop toward us. Every time Harrington modified the safety systems, he had to log in the federal database within 24 hours, and he signed every single change personally because he's too paranoid to let anyone else have that authority. The recording Emily found next was even worse. A video conference from last week, where Harrington specifically discussed the fixes I'd made to the V12 prototype. His voice filled the hotel room through the laptop speakers. The mechanic, Chun, actually fixed the sensor issue, made it safe, which means we need to reverse his modifications before mass production begins, and make sure the original specifications are restored to ensure proper market timing. Proper market timing, Sarah repeated, her voice dripping with disgust. He means making sure people die on schedule for his stock trades. But then we found the document that made everything else look like parking tickets. A board meeting transcript from yesterday, after I'd been terminated, where all 12 board members discussed what they called Project Phoenix Rising. William Cross, the lead board member, had actually said the words that would haunt me forever. "Gentlemen, once the merger is announced and our positions are liquidated, we'll have approximately 6 weeks before the first failures begin, and after the merger, we'll all be retired before the murders start." They said murders, not accidents, not failures, not incidents. Murders, like they all knew exactly what they were doing and had decided the money was worth becoming serial killers in suits. Every single board member had agreed, had signed off on the plan, had calculated their profit margins from planned deaths, and now they were all planning to flee the country before the consequences arrived. "How do we trap someone who owns judges?" I asked, feeling the weight of what we were up against, knowing that even with all this evidence, Harrington might still walk free because justice was just another thing he could buy. "We don't trap him," Emily said slowly, an idea forming behind her eyes. "We let him trap himself, in front of witnesses he can't buy or threaten. The media, the employees, the whole world watching live. Have you found the perfect evidence, but couldn't use it because the system was rigged against you from the start?" That's when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and when I opened it, my heart stopped for a moment. "Mr. Chun, I believe we have matters to discuss regarding your termination. Join me at tomorrow's board meeting. Come alone. R.H." Harrington was inviting me into his trap, but what he didn't know was that we were about to turn his own boardroom into a courtroom where the jury would be 23,000 Apex employees and the verdict would be broadcast live to the world. "He wants to control the narrative," Tom said, looking at the invitation. "Probably planning to humiliate you in front of everyone, make you look crazy or desperate." "Good," I said, feeling my rage crystallize into something harder and more useful. Strategy. Let him think he's in control while we use his own recording system, his own broadcast network, his own arrogance against him. The decision to confront him publicly wasn't about courage or revenge anymore. It was about those 50,000 families who didn't know they were about to lose someone, about my father who deserved justice, about Tony Kim and all the others who had died for Harrington's portfolio, and about proving that sometimes, just sometimes, a mechanic with dirty hands could bring down a CEO with clean fingernails. The morning of the board meeting, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, trying to tie the necktie from my father's old suit, the navy blue one he'd worn at my high school graduation and my mother's funeral and every important moment in between. And even though it was slightly dated with wider lapels than what people wore now, It fit me perfectly, like he'd known someday I'd need armor made from memory and love. The fabric still smelled faintly of his cologne mixed with motor oil that never quite washed out, and as I smoothed down the jacket, I felt him with me in a way that made my hands steady, even though I was about to walk into a trap set by a billionaire who'd already tried to kill my family once. Emily had called her sister Diana the night before, and it turned out Diana Foster was an FBI agent who'd been watching Apex for 3 years, but could never get enough evidence to act on. And when she met us at a truck stop diner at dawn, she looked like a younger version of Emily, but with eyes that had seen too much. I can't officially do anything until a crime is committed in my presence or publicly documented, she said, sliding her badge across the table to show us she was real. But if Harrington confesses to anything on that broadcast system that goes to all employees, I'll have 40 agents ready to move within minutes. He's too smart to confess on camera, Tom said, but Diana smiled in a way that reminded me why Emily was so good at planning. He's also too arrogant to believe anyone would dare record him secretly, Diana replied, then handed me a pen that looked completely normal except for the tiny camera and microphone Emily had built into it. Michigan is a one-party consent state for recording, and everything this captures will be admissible in federal court. Sarah had spent the morning tracking the board members' travel plans, and 7 of them had flights booked for that evening to various non-extradition countries, which meant they all knew something was coming and planned to run before it hit. They're going to announce the merger, cash out their stocks, and disappear before the first V-12 kills someone, she said, showing us the flight manifest she'd somehow accessed. I knew exactly where to strike. The plan was simple in the way that dangerous things often are. I would go to the private meeting with Harrington first, get him angry enough to say something incriminating, then make sure whatever happened next was witnessed by thousands of employees who couldn't all be bought or threatened into silence. The hard part would be surviving whatever Harrington had planned for me in that private room, where nobody would see what happened except his security cameras that he controlled completely. When I arrived at Apex headquarters wearing my father's suit and carrying nothing but the pen camera and my phone, the receptionist looked at me like I was a ghost, probably because everyone knew I'd been terminated and shouldn't be allowed in the building. "Mr. Harrington is expecting me," I said calmly, and she made a phone call before nodding toward the executive elevator, her eyes following me like she was watching someone walk to their execution. Conference room, it was on the top floor, all glass and chrome with a view of the entire factory complex below, and Harrington was standing with his back to me when I entered, looking out at his empire like a king surveying his kingdom. "Mr. Chun," he said without turning around, "the grease monkey who thinks he's a crusader." "Mr. Harrington," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "the CEO who thinks he's untouchable." He turned then, and I saw something in his eyes that made me understand why my father had been so afraid that night in the hospital. This wasn't just a corrupt executive. This was someone who genuinely enjoyed destroying people, who got pleasure from having the power to end lives with a pen stroke. "You've been busy," he said, walking closer with deliberate slowness, "breaking into my building, stealing my property, spreading lies to anyone who will listen. Everything I've said is true, and you know it," I said, standing my ground even though every instinct told me to run. "Truth is whatever I pay judges to say it is," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But you already know that, don't you? Just like you know your father's accident wasn't really an accident." The admission hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my face blank, letting the pen record every word while my hand stayed steady at my sides. "You tried to kill him because he was going to expose you." "I didn't try anything," Harrington said, moving closer until I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else. Anticipation, like a predator about to strike. "I succeeded in stopping him, just like I'll succeed in stopping you." That's when he lunged at me, his hands going for my throat with surprising speed for someone his age. But I'd spent 15 years lifting heavy engines, and my father had taught me to defend myself against bigger opponents. I caught his wrists and twisted, using his momentum to push him back against the conference table. And for a moment we stood there locked in position, him trying to choke me while I held him off, both of us breathing hard. "What do you want?" he snarled, his face red with effort and rage. "Money? Your job back. Name your price, and let's end this stupidity." "I want justice," I said, pushing him away and straightening my father's suit jacket. "For my father, for Tony Kim, for everyone you've murdered for profit." He laughed then, a sound that was somehow worse than his anger. Justice? You want justice? There is no justice, only power, and those too weak to take it. Have you ever walked into the lion's den on purpose, knowing you might not walk out, but going anyway, because some things matter more than safety? The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, he said, composing himself and smoothing his tie like we hadn't just been fighting. You're welcome to attend, to watch me announce a merger that will make me richer than you can imagine, to see how the real world works when you have real power. I'll be there, I said, heading for the door with the pen camera still recording in my pocket. Mr. Chun, he called after me, and I turned to see him smiling again. Your father survived because I allowed it, because a dead martyr is more dangerous than a broken cripple. But that mercy can be revoked at any time. The threat against my father should have made me angry, but instead it made me certain. Harrington had just confessed to attempted murder on camera, and in 10 minutes, he was about to confess to much more in front of 23,000 witnesses. The main auditorium was packed like no board meeting I'd ever seen, with 12 board members sitting at their curved table on the stage, about 50 senior executives in the first few rows, reporters from major business papers in the back, and a red light blinking on the camera that was broadcasting live to every Apex facility around the world. 23,000 employees watching what they thought would be a boring quarterly update, but was about to become the most important broadcast in company history. The room buzzed with important people talking to other important people, all of them ignoring me as I slipped into a seat in the middle rows, just another face in the crowd wearing a slightly outdated suit. Emily had texted me that she was in place in the control room where her old engineering department badge still worked because HR never updated the security system properly. And Sarah confirmed that Tom had filed whistleblower reports with the SEC precisely timed to arrive during the meeting, while Diana had positioned FBI agents at every exit of the building. All I had to do was watch and wait for Harrington to hang himself with his own words. Ladies and gentlemen, Harrington began exactly at 11 a.m., standing at the podium with the confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. Q4 has been our strongest quarter in company history, and I'm pleased to announce that the new Phoenix V12 engine pre-orders have exceeded our most optimistic projections, with first deliveries scheduled for next month. That's when every screen in the auditorium flickered once, twice, and then changed from the quarterly sales charts to a video of Harrington's office from last week, and his own voice filled the room through the speakers. The mechanic actually fixed it. Chun made it safe. We'll need to reverse his modifications before mass production begins to ensure proper market timing. Another voice from the recording. But if the engines are safe now, why change them back? Harrington's recorded laugh was cold as he answered. Because safe engines don't fail at 10,000 miles, and without failures, we don't get stock dips to buy back at a discount. The whole profit model depends on precisely timed, catastrophic failures. The entire auditorium went absolutely silent, like everyone had forgotten how to breathe at the same time, and I watched Harrington at the podium fumbling with his laptop, trying to stop the recording, but Emily had locked him out of his own system. The silence was broken only by the sound of coffee cups being set down, frozen halfway to open mouths, as the recording continued with Harrington saying, "After the merger announcement, we'll all be retired in the Caymans before the first failures hit the news." "This is fake," Harrington shouted, his face turning the same color red as when I'd blocked his attack in the conference room. "Someone has doctored these recordings. This is corporate sabotage." But the screens kept changing, showing email after email, memo after memo, meeting minutes where they calculated acceptable fatality rates against profit margins, the document about my father's accident being deliberately caused, and finally, the board meeting from yesterday where they all discussed Project Phoenix Rising, and the word murders was used repeatedly. The press in the back row erupted with questions, cameras flashing as they captured the chaos unfolding on stage, and board members started standing up, some heading for exits only to find the doors wouldn't open because Emily had triggered the emergency lockdown system that was designed to keep people in during safety drills. William Cross, the lead board member, stood up and pointed at Harrington. "Richard, what is this? You told us the legal department cleared all of this." "Shut up, Bill." Harrington snarled, but the damage was done. The board members were turning on each other in front of every employee and reporter, each trying to save themselves as the evidence kept playing on every screen. That's when I stood up from my seat and walked toward the stage, feeling strangely calm, even as security moved to intercept me. "Everything you're seeing is real," I called out, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "Every email, every recording, every document is authentic and already filed with federal authorities." The security guards hesitated, looking to Harrington for instructions, and in that moment of confusion, the main doors opened, and Diana walked in with 20 FBI agents in jackets with the letters clear across their backs. "Richard Harrington," Diana announced, her voice echoing through the suddenly silent room. "You're under arrest for securities fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of the RICO Act." Harrington looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting from exit to exit, and then he did something I didn't expect. He jumped off the stage and ran for the emergency stairwell, shoving people out his way as he fled from justice. But I knew this building as well as I knew my father's face, knew every door and staircase from 15 years of working here, and I was waiting at the emergency exit when he burst through it, chest heaving as he tried to escape. "You destroyed my father," I said, standing between him and freedom. "You killed 43 people, and you're going to kill thousands more. You're nobody," he screamed, his perfect CEO mask completely shattered to reveal the monster underneath. "A grease monkey. A nothing. I'm a mechanic who fixed what you broke," I said, as FBI agents caught up and surrounded him. "And now I'm fixing the system that let you exist." The visible consequences were immediate. As they led Harrington away in handcuffs, the looks on the faces of the executives who had ignored me for 15 years, who had walked past me like I was invisible, who had never bothered to learn my name despite my fixing their company's problems every day. Those looks of shock and fear and sudden understanding were something I'll never forget. The employees watching on the broadcast from factories and offices around the world saw their CEO admit to murder for profit, saw the board members turn on each other like hungry wolves, saw a mechanic in a slightly outdated suit bring down a billion-dollar criminal with nothing but evidence and determination. Have you ever watched karma arrive in real time? Seen justice finally catch up to someone who thought they were above it all? "You have no idea what you've done," Harrington said as the agents pushed him toward the door, his voice quiet enough that only I could hear. "There are hundreds like me. Thousands. You can't stop us all." "No," I replied, thinking of my father and all the others who had suffered. "But I stopped you. And that's enough for today." The click of handcuffs closing around Harrington's wrists was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, like the final piece of an engine sliding perfectly into place after hours of work, and I watched as the metal bit into his expensive suit jacket. Probably the first time in his life something hadn't bent to his will. FBI agents flanked him on both sides as they walked him through the lobby, where just 30 minutes earlier he had strutted in like a king, and now employees lined the hallways, silently watching the man who had threatened their livelihoods and safety for years finally facing consequences. "This is a mistake," Harrington kept saying to anyone who would listen, his voice rising with each repetition. "I have friends in Washington. I know the governor personally. This won't stand." But nobody was stepping forward to help him now. Not the security team that had followed his every order. Not the executives who had laughed at his jokes and ignored his crimes. Not the board members who were now being handcuffed themselves, one by one, as additional FBI agents entered the building. The entire leadership of a billion-dollar company was being dismantled in real time, and I stood in the lobby watching it happen while employees from every department gathered in silent witness. News vans were already pulling up outside, reporters rushing toward the building with cameras and microphones ready, because Diana had tipped off selected journalists she trusted about what was happening, ensuring the story couldn't be buried or twisted. The first headline appeared on phones around me. Apex CEO arrested in murder-for-profit scheme, followed by stock alerts showing that trading on Apex shares had been halted due to excessive volatility. But the real consequences were just beginning. Janet Morrison was arrested in her office 2 hours later when FBI agents found emails proving she had knowingly participated in the cover-up of my father's accident and had helped frame me for industrial espionage. Her face as they led her away was haunted, her eyes finding mine in the crowd for just a moment before looking away in shame. The VP position she had sacrificed her integrity for would never happen now, replaced instead by a prison cell and the knowledge that she had betrayed someone who had trusted her completely. Paul Morrison, the head engineer who had been promoted beyond his abilities, immediately turned on Harrington and offered to testify in exchange for immunity, telling investigators about every meeting where safety concerns were dismissed and deaths were calculated as acceptable losses. He was small and scared in his fancy suit as he was led to a conference room for questioning. Nothing like the confident man who had sneered at my suggestions for years. Mike Kowalski, our union representative who had taken bribes to keep workers from reporting safety violations, was caught trying to board a flight to Costa Rica and arrested at the gate, his suitcase filled with cash and a fake passport. The man who was supposed to protect us had been selling us out all along, and the look on his face on the evening news showed he knew exactly how his former union brothers would feel about his betrayal. Who else will fall? Became a question on everyone's lips as the arrests continued throughout the day, spreading from Apex to regulatory agencies, where officials who had looked the other way were now being investigated, to politicians who had taken donations in exchange for blocking safety legislation, to judges who had dismissed lawsuits from families of victims. Diana Foster called me that evening, her voice tired but satisfied. The evidence is overwhelming. Marcus, the recordings, the emails, the financial records. There's no way for Harrington to wiggle out of this. We're looking at multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, securities fraud, racketeering, witness tampering, and about 50 other federal charges. He'll die in prison. I sat in my small apartment, still wearing my father's suit that now smelled like the day's events, like justice and vindication, and the end of a nightmare that had lasted 15 years. On my TV, every channel showed footage of Harrington being walked into the federal courthouse, his perfect hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face finally showing the monster that had always lived behind his polished mask. The Department of Transportation had issued an emergency recall for all V12 engines, preventing them from ever reaching consumers, and Sarah estimated that action alone had saved potentially thousands of lives. The stock market had reacted with shock to the revelations, and financial analysts were calling it the most significant corporate fraud case since Enron, with ripple effects spreading through the entire automotive industry. Have you seen a toxic leader finally face consequences, watched as their power and connections and money suddenly couldn't protect them anymore? I drove to my father's care facility that night, still trying to process everything that had happened, and found him watching the news in his room, his eyes fixed on the screen where Harrington's face appeared every few minutes in handcuffs. When he saw me come in wearing his old suit, something in his expression changed, a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized he'd been carrying all these years. "They're saying a mechanic brought down the CEO," he said, pointing at the TV where my name was now scrolling across the bottom of the screen. "That's my son." I sat beside his wheelchair and took his hand, feeling the strength still there despite everything he'd been through. "Dad, I'm sorry it took so long." He shook his head, his eyes clearer than I'd seen them in years. "You did what I couldn't finish. You didn't just fix an engine. You fixed a broken system. The trials would take months, testimony would drain me in ways I couldn't imagine, and rebuilding the company would be a challenge greater than anything I've faced before. But in that moment, sitting with my father while the man who had tried to kill him faced justice, I finally felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 12 years old: peace. There are thousands like me," Harrington had said during his arrest, a final attempt to make me feel small and powerless. "You can't stop us all. But I stopped you," I'd replied. "And that's enough for today." It wasn't just enough, it was everything. The trials lasted 18 months, though it felt like 18 years some days, with my testimony stretching across 12 different days in 4 separate cases. And each time I entered the courthouse, I carried my father's employee badge in my pocket, rubbing my thumb across its worn surface whenever Harrington's expensive lawyers tried to twist the truth. The weight of that small plastic rectangle kept me grounded when they called me a disgruntled employee, a thief, a hacker, a liar. All the things powerful people call regular folks who finally stand up to them. I wore my father's navy blue suit to every hearing. And on the day they sentenced Harrington, the courtroom was packed with families of victims who had waited years for this moment, their faces showing a mixture of grief and relief as the judge spoke the words they'd thought they'd never hear. Richard Harrington III, on the charges of conspiracy to commit murder. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, the judge announced, and the sound of her gavel hitting the wooden block echoed through the silent room like the final heartbeat of Harrington's empire. On the additional charges of securities fraud, racketeering, and witness tampering, an additional 15 years to be served consecutively. Harrington stood there in his orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller somehow, the color draining from his face as he realized he would die in prison, all his money and connections unable to save him from spending the rest of his life in a cell the size of his former bathroom. His eyes found mine across the courtroom, and I saw something I never expected. Fear. The same fear my father must have felt when that engine exploded because of Harrington's orders. Janet Morrison cried through her entire sentencing hearing, repeating over and over that she was just following orders, until the judge reminded her that defense hadn't worked at Nuremberg and wouldn't work here either. 5 years and loss of pension benefits. Not enough for what she'd done to my father, to me, to all the workers she pretended to care about, but something at least. 6 board members received prison sentences ranging from 3 to 12 years, while the others got probation and massive fines in exchange for testimony that helped convict Harrington, each one turning on the others in a desperate attempt to save themselves, their perfect corporate family falling apart when actual consequences appeared. The company itself faced a crisis unlike anything in automotive history. Stock down 80%, executives either arrested or fled, employees demoralized and afraid for their jobs, and 50,000 V12 engines that needed to be completely redesigned before they could be sold. Bankruptcy court appointed an emergency board to try to save the 23,000 jobs at stake. And that's when the most unexpected thing happened. The board had an unexpected proposal. They needed someone who understood the products from the ground up, someone the factory workers would trust after years of betrayal, someone who had proven they valued human lives over profits, someone who could speak to both the engineering challenges and the human cost of failure. They offered me the position of Chief Operating Officer. Me, Marcus Chun, the grease monkey, the nobody, the line mechanic who had brought down a CEO, was suddenly being asked to help rebuild the company that had tried to destroy my family. My first instinct was to say no. After everything Apex had done, why would I want to save it? But then I thought about the 23,000 employees who needed jobs, the families who depended on those paychecks, the opportunity to create something that actually helped people instead of harming them. And I remembered what my father had always taught me. Fixing things isn't just about making them work, it's about making them right. I accepted on 3 conditions. Sarah Kim would become CFO, Tom Rodriguez would become Chief Legal Officer, and Dr. Emily Foster would return as Head of Engineering. The emergency board agreed without hesitation, probably because they had no better options. And, just like that, the people who had been pushed aside, demoted, or fired for doing the right thing were now in charge of fixing what Harrington had broken. Have you ever gotten the promotion in the worst way? Reached a dream position only after fighting through a nightmare to get there? The first time I visited my father after accepting the position, he was watching the news in his room, the TV showing footage of the recalled V12 engines being modified to finally be safe. "That's my son," he told his nurse, pointing at the screen where my name appeared. "He fixes things." Those 4 simple words meant more to me than any fancy title or corner office ever could. Because in the end, that's who I had always been. Someone who fixed what others broke. Someone who cared more about getting it right than getting ahead. Someone who saw problems as opportunities to make things better. And now, somehow, I was in a position to fix the biggest broken thing of all. A company that had forgotten that people matter more than profits. 6 months into my new role as COO, I arrived at my office early one morning to find an envelope on my desk that hadn't come through the mailroom. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, the kind that cost more than I used to make in an hour. And when I opened it, I recognized the handwriting immediately. So similar to his father's signatures I'd seen on countless documents during the trial, but somehow softer around the edges. The letter was from David Harrington IV, the son of the man I had sent to prison. "Mr. Chun," it began, the perfect penmanship making me think of private schools and silver spoons and a life so different from mine it might as well have been from another planet. "You don't know me, but I know all about you. I've watched everything you've done to expose my father's crimes and rebuild the company he nearly destroyed. By all rights, I should hate you for what happened to my family. But I don't. The truth is, I've known what my father was since I was 16 years old and found documents about the 2008 cover-up in his home office. I confronted him, begged him to stop, to recall the engines, to save lives. He laughed, and told me I didn't understand business. You didn't just stop him from killing more people. You stopped him from completely destroying our family's legacy. My children won't have to live with the weight of unexposed murders on their shoulders. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for being the man my father should have been. The world needs more mechanics and fewer executives. David. I read the letter 3 times, feeling the weight of his words sink in, thinking about how courage sometimes skips a generation, how this young man had tried to stop his father long before I entered the picture, and how different things might have been if people had listened to him instead of dismissing him as just a naive kid who didn't understand business. Have you ever been thanked by unexpected people, received gratitude from someone you thought would consider you an enemy? I placed the letter carefully in my desk drawer, next to my father's employee badge and a photo from my first day as a mechanic, a reminder that sometimes doing what's right hurts people you never meant to hurt, but that doesn't make it any less necessary. Apex survived, though not as the company it had been. We were different now, better in ways that mattered, but maybe smaller in ways Wall Street cared about, and I was fine with that trade-off. We recalled every single engine with a defective design, replacing them all for free regardless of warranty status, a move that cost $890 million and had some board members worried about bankruptcy. We'll survive, I told them during a tense meeting where financial projections looked grim. The 43 people killed by our negligence didn't have that option. My first official act as COO was to implement the Marcus Chun Senior Safety Protocol. Any employee, from the newest line worker to the most senior engineer, could stop production if they identified a safety concern, with no retaliation permitted and no questions asked until the concern was fully investigated. The second change was the Transparency Initiative, making all executive meetings recorded and available to employees, ending the era of secret decisions that affected people's lives. The third was hardest for the finance team to accept: the Victim Compensation Fund that dedicated 5% of all profits to helping families affected by past defects, not because we were legally required to, but because it was right. Sarah transformed our financial systems, making every transaction transparent, every trade documented, turning us into what Business Week called the most financially transparent automotive company in history. Tom rewrote our legal framework, establishing whistleblower protections that actually protected people and ethics policies with real consequences. Emily redesigned the V12 engine from the ground up, creating what we now call the Phoenix V12, named for rising from the ashes of corruption. 3 months after taking over, we invited my father to the plant for the official launch of the first Phoenix V12 production line. He came in his wheelchair, wearing his old Apex jacket that we'd found in storage, and as employees lined the factory floor, many of whom had worked alongside him years ago, he pressed the button that started the first engine off the line. The engine purred to life with a sound so perfect that some of the older mechanics actually had tears in their eyes, and my father smiled the way he used to before the accident, before Harrington, before everything broke. "That's how an engine should sound," he said, and the workers applauded. Not for me or for the engine, but for him and for all the workers who have been silenced or ignored or injured or killed by corporate greed that finally had a reckoning. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside, his weathered hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly, and those 4 simple words hit me harder than anything had in years, making me think of her dying too young from cancer we couldn't afford better treatment for, a different kind of corporate greed, a different fight for another day. "I did this for you, Dad," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "No," he replied, his eyes clear and certain. "You did it because it was right. That's what makes you different from them." 3 years have passed since that December morning, when Harrington called me a grease monkey in front of everyone I worked with. 3 years since I fixed an engine and started a chain of events that would send a CEO to prison and change an entire industry. I still have my corner office with the view of the factory floor, still start most mornings talking to the line workers before meetings with executives, and still have grease under my fingernails more often than not, because I believe you can't lead what you don't understand. The company is different now. We're not the biggest automotive supplier anymore, not the most profitable on paper, but we're the safest according to every independent testing agency, the most ethical according to business watchdogs, and the one parents trust most when buying cars for their teenage drivers. Last week, A young mechanic named Maria Lopez found a potential defect in our new hybrid engine during routine testing, and she immediately pulled the emergency stop that triggered the Marcus Chun's senior safety protocol, halting production across 3 lines and costing us $2 million in delays while engineers verified her concerns. Some executives grumbled about the cost until they saw the data. She had been right. The design would have failed under specific conditions, and her action potentially saved lives. I promoted her on the spot. But I cost the company money, she said, looking confused in my office. You save lives, I replied. That's worth more than money. She reminded me of myself 15 years ago, eager, talented, hands that knew engines better than some engineers with fancy degrees. And the difference was that now the system was worth trusting. Now someone like her could rise based on merit instead of connections. Harrington was wrong about one thing. He told me there were thousands like him, that I couldn't stop them all, that the system would always favor people like him over people like me. But here's what I've learned in 3 years of rebuilding what he tried to destroy. You don't have to stop them all at once. You just have to show others it's possible. That one mechanic with evidence and courage can bring down a corrupt CEO. That documentation and determination can overcome money and power. Every week, I get emails from employees at other companies who found defects, fraud, corruption, asking for advice on how to speak up safely, and I tell them all the same thing. Document everything. Find allies. Don't fight alone. And remember, you're not just fixing a product, you're fixing a system that affects real people's lives. Richard Harrington? He spends his days in federal prison, working in the machine shop, finally learning what it means to get his hands dirty. I heard he's actually not bad at it, turning out license plates with neat corners and smooth edges. Turns out that when you strip away the suits and power and money, some people can actually learn useful skills. Others just rust. The Phoenix V12 is now in its 3rd generation, with over 1 million units on the road and not a single safety recall. It's the engine my father would have built if anyone had listened to him 15 years ago. The engine that reminds me every day that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't be, and then surpassing even that. I'm Marcus Chun. I was a mechanic. I became a CEO. But really, I'm still just someone who fixes broken things, whether they're engines or companies or systems that forgot who they're supposed to serve. And now the mechanics are in charge.